Around the world, there are countless reports of bizarre mysteries which have never been solved. The most perplexing among them are the stories of individuals who have vanished without a trace, never to be seen again. The circumstances surrounding many of these cases are often so impossible and out of the ordinary that they are compared to works of fiction. These are the real-life X-Files. On June 8, 1985, the city of Sao Paulo in Brazil would experience one of its most perplexing disappearances, a mystery that the Brazilian media has compared to shows like The X-Files. The day before, on June 7th, 15-year-old Marco Aurélio Simon was excited to embark on his camping trip at the Pico dos Marins mountains in the small municipality of Piquete. Marco, who had just become a senior scout, was accompanied to the train station by his father, Ivo Simon, his twin brother Marco Antonio, and Juan Cespedes, his scout leader, who was also a close family friend. At the train station, Marco and Juan would meet with the other three scouts that would be joining them that day, Ricardo Salvion, Osvaldo Machado, as well as Ramades Ron. Together, they would begin their journey towards the mountain. Little did Marco's brother and father know, this would be the last time they would ever see him. Marco and the scouts would arrive at the mountain range around 2 p.m. that day, where they were greeted by Alfonso Xavier, a local guide who lived in the area and knew it well. He suggested a location for them to settle and put up their tents, which was on his property. After doing so, the six went for a swim in a nearby river. When they would arrive back to their camp, the group would bizarrely find that their belongings had seemingly been rummaged through. Juan asked Alfonso if he had seen anyone else in the area, but because nothing was stolen, he told him it was probably just local stray dogs and that he had not seen anyone around. That night, one of the scouts, Osvaldo, would recall feeling extremely uneasy, as if the group was being watched. Scout leader Juan reportedly felt the same way, claiming he heard someone hit his tent from the outside when he was trying to sleep, only to find no one there when he went to check. These strange events were perhaps foreshadowing what would happen the following day. The next morning, after breakfast, the group got ready and set off on their hike up the mountain. The path was steep, but still rather easy to climb without any special equipment, and the walk to the top usually took roughly 6 hours. When the group was approximately 3/4 of the way up, however, Osvaldo had stepped into a hole and hurt his knee. This injury made it impossible for him to continue on hiking, meaning the group would have to turn back. Juan and the scouts then improvised a makeshift stretcher using logs and rope to take Osvaldo down the mountain. At that point, Marco offered to make his way back to camp ahead of the group. This way, he could already have help waiting for Osvaldo when the rest of them arrived. The group, especially Osvaldo, would be against this idea, arguing they should remain together. After some deliberation, Juan finally authorized Marco to go down the mountain by himself ahead of the group. He insisted, however, that Marco take a piece of chalk and mark the stones along his path with the number 240 until he reached the campsite. This was the identifying number of the scout group they were a part of. Juan instructed Marco to start marking the stones as soon as he got outside of the group's line of sight so they could trace back what route he took. There were multiple ways back to camp, and if Marco was going to be ahead of the group anyway, he could perhaps find a faster path down the mountain to get Osvaldo help more quickly. Marco would then proceed to take off before the group, and they would follow in his footsteps, watching Marco as he got farther and farther away until they could no longer see him. Juan and the other 3 scouts made their way along the path Marco took, passing 3 stones with the 240 inscription. They would eventually encounter a fork in the road, and judging by where the last stone was marked, Juan knew Marco had gone left. Juan decided that it would be better to take the path on the right, however, as he believed there were too many obstacles along the route Marco took, and they would not be able to navigate the terrain properly while carrying Osvaldo in the stretcher. This was against the group's wishes, who wanted to just follow Marco. But since Juan was their leader and far more experienced, they eventually obliged. The path they took was easier, as Juan suggested. However, it was much longer, and due to this, their arrival back to the camp would be heavily delayed. Although Osvaldo had injured himself at around 2 p.m. on the 8th, they would not return back to base until roughly 5 a.m. the following morning. When the scouts finally did arrive back to camp, they were rather puzzled at the sight which would be awaiting them, or more accurately, the lack thereof. There was absolutely nobody there to help Osvaldo, and Marco was nowhere to be found. Strangely enough, however, the group would notice Marco's backpack open outside his tent, even though all 5 of them left their backpacks neatly organized inside their tents when they left. This raised numerous questions. For one, if Marco made it back to camp as his open backpack suggested, why didn't he get help, as he said he would? Where did he go after searching his backpack, if not to look for help? And most importantly, where could he be? These questions inspired Juan to conduct a search of the area in hopes of finding Marco or any clues which might help him answer them. After searching for 5 hours to no avail, Juan decided it was finally time to call authorities. Police arrived almost immediately, but their investigation would yield no further results. On the second night of searches, the scouts who were hiking with Marco would experience something truly bizarre. The 3 boys, as well as their scout leader, decided to remain at Pico dos Marins in order to assist in the effort to find Marco. They were staying at the house of Alfonso Xavier, however, which was located close to where they initially set up camp. As they were getting ready to sleep that night, they would hear very loud, repetitive whistling coming from the forest. Knowing that Marco had his survival whistle on him at the time, which was customary for all scouts, the group figured it must have been him. They ran out of the house and followed the direction of the whistling, hearing it get louder and more frantic the closer they got to the area it was coming from. They then saw what was described as 3 flashes of intense blue light, followed by a dead silence. The scouts shouted for Marco and used their whistles to try and get a response. However, they could hear absolutely nothing. This was the event that really left the scouts, searchers, and reporters at the scene alike baffled. Over the course of the next 28 days, one of the largest searches ever in Brazil's history would take place at Pico dos Marins. Marco's father, who had many connections in the nearby municipality of Lorena, mobilized more than 180 soldiers from the Light Infantry Battalion to take part in the search. Military police, firefighters, rescue specialists, climbers, bushmen, dogs, and even helicopters sent by the governor of Sao Paulo would be dispatched to try and locate Marco. Despite this, not a single shred of evidence was ever discovered, and Marco Aurélio Simon was never seen again. This disappearance remains one of the most bizarre in Brazil's history, as there are just too many unanswered questions. For one, if Marco did indeed return to camp as his open backpack suggested, what did he do in the time between arriving to camp and being heard in the forest on the second night of searches? While we cannot know for sure that the whistling came from Marco, it can be reasonably assumed because he had a whistle on him and it was heard in the vicinity of where he disappeared. If so, however, what could he possibly have been up to in this time span of more than 24 hours? It just doesn't make sense for him to have been heard on the trail nearly 2 days after his disappearance. The trails they took would eventually meet, so either Marco would have bumped into the group on his way back up, or, if he missed them, he would have quickly realized and gone back down. There's no logical explanation as to why Marco would have still been on the trail 2 days after the initial incident. The marked stones were also peculiar in this case. Searchers only ever found the 3 stones marked with the number 240, which were previously already discovered by the group on their way back down the mountain. This begs the question, why didn't Marco inscribe any more stones after those 3? Juan instructed him to mark stones all the way along his path until he reached close to camp. The fact that Marco didn't suggests that something may have happened to him after he marked the 3rd stone. We know, however, that Marco likely made it back to camp, so why would he have chosen to not mark any more stones, especially considering his group was relying on him to? Lastly, what were the flashes of blue light on the second night of searches? Alfonso Xavier, who was also present, insisted that the lights were from the city. However, Juan and the scouts who were much closer to the scene were adamant that the blue flashes were coming from the same area the whistling was coming from. They would also report the two events as being correlated, claiming the whistling stopped the moment they saw the flashes. These bizarre pulses of light added a degree of mystery to this case, which attracted UFOologists and mystics. What they were, though, is anyone's guess at this point. Although very thorough, the police's investigation would not find an answer to any of these questions. With such a bizarre case, it's hard to even imagine what could have occurred. It's unlikely that it was something as simple as him getting lost, because the area was too close to the city, and you could literally see it from the mountain. On top of this, Marco was a scout, and he was trained for exactly this type of scenario. Scout leader Juan was suspected for some time because he allowed Marco to go on ahead, alone, which should never be done in the wilderness, and he searched for him many hours before finally alerting police. He was thoroughly examined and questioned by detectives, however, who concluded his actions were merely incompetent, not intentionally malicious. Marco's own father vouched for Juan, saying he had known him for years and this was not in his character. Juan would even later claim that advanced interrogation techniques were used on him by Brazilian forces. Police also looked into others who may have been in the area. However, there was nobody else in the vicinity except for another scout group and Alfonso Xavier. They were questioned and police determined they had nothing to do with the boys vanishing. Another Pico dos Marins guide who assisted in the search, by the name of João Correa, would later claim that, quote, "We entered everything that we could enter. If he was not found, it is because he was not in the area. If he was there, we would have found him." This sentiment was shared by many who were involved in the search for Marco, but at the same time, there was no evidence he left the area either, making his case very perplexing. But what really did happen to Marco Aurélio Simon on that day, 37 years ago? With the lack of evidence, it's likely we may never know. Some are of the opinion that he got injured and succumbed to the elements. Others speculate that he may have encountered someone who wanted to hurt him on his way back down the mountain. And of course, with the bizarre nature of this case, there are those who remain adamant that Marco was taken. Aircraft disappearing while attempting to intercept a UFO has been a recurring theme in alien movies since their inception. Unbeknownst to some, however, there is a very well-documented real-life account of exactly this scenario. It would come to be known as the Kinross Incident, named after the now-defunct Kinross Air Force Base in Upper Michigan, where the event took place. Shortly after sunset on November 23, 1953, First Lieutenant Felix Eugene Moncla was called upon to intercept an unidentified radar blip, which was flying over Lake Superior near the city of Sault Ste. Marie in Michigan. Radar operators from the base witnessed an unusual object which suddenly appeared on their radar return, prompting them to dispatch the skilled Air Force pilot. Moncla would take off in pursuit of the craft, flying in an F-89C Scorpion fighter jet. He was accompanied by Second Lieutenant Robert L. Wilson, who served as radar operator aboard Moncla's jet. For some reason, it appeared that the closer Moncla got to the unidentified craft, the more difficulty Wilson would experience trying to maintain coverage of it on the Scorpion's radar, as if the object was somehow jamming the onboard system. This forced them to rely on the guidance of ground radar operators to keep them flying in the direction of the object. At an altitude of approximately 8,000 feet and a speed nearing 500 miles per hour, it seemed that Moncla and Wilson were about to make contact with the unidentified craft. It was around 7 p.m. at this point, as the ground crew nervously watched the jet's radar blip closing in on the object, expecting Moncla to report back what it was any moment. Unfortunately, this is not what would happen. The ground crew witnessed the blip of Moncla's jet get closer and closer to the unidentified blip on the radar. He approached the object up until they were almost touching on the screen. Then, strangely enough, the two blips seemed to merge into one, and Moncla's jet disappeared altogether. At first, it was assumed the jet was perhaps just flying over or under the object, but it never reappeared. Seconds later, the unidentified object vanished off the screen as well, just as suddenly as it emerged. It did not get out of the radar's range. It just disappeared from 1 second to the next. Ground control was baffled and could not understand what was happening. They made repeated attempts to contact Moncla and Wilson, but it seemed they lost communication. This scene was already bizarre to say the least, but it would only get stranger from there. Following numerous unsuccessful attempts to reach Moncla, a lieutenant by the name of William Mingenbach, along with a radar operator, were dispatched to locate him and Robert Wilson. They were airborne by 7:15 p.m. and were quickly approaching the location where communications were lost. Along the way, Mingenbach's radar operator made continuous attempts to contact Moncla by radio. Despite this, he never heard anything back, nor did he pick up any sign of Moncla's jet on the radar system. This would change at 7:35. However, when Mingenbach and his radar operator would receive a brief radio transmission. They could distinctly hear Moncla with his thick southern accent saying, "I think we better," followed by several other words they could not completely make out before the transmission went silent. Mingenbach believed that Moncla was talking to Wilson, however, and this transmission was not meant for them. In the minutes following, they tried desperately to re-establish contact with Moncla through that radio frequency, but were unsuccessful. Now, this transmission was extremely bizarre because it occurred at 7:35, over half an hour after the ground control crew lost track of Moncla and Wilson. At first, it was assumed that their jet had perhaps crashed into the unidentified object, and that's why contact was lost. But how then is it possible that Moncla's voice was heard a significant amount of time after the fact? Furthermore, why did Moncla sound so calm on the transmission? Mingenbach claimed that he sounded a bit on edge, but nothing out of the ordinary. If Moncla and Wilson did indeed crash, they surely would have been making frantic mayday calls and asking for assistance. The fact that Moncla didn't seem to be in any distress does not make sense in this scenario. Also, if Moncla's jet crashed the moment he disappeared off radar, he obviously would not have had the means to contact anyone via radio. So where could this transmission have even come from anyway? These questions prompted an intensive search of Lake Superior and its shoreline over the next 5 days. Not a single sign of Moncla, Wilson, or their jet was ever discovered. It's perplexing that nothing was found because ground crew knew exactly where contact with Moncla was lost, and a high-speed jet crash would have produced a significant amount of debris. The fact that there were no remnants of the jet anywhere in the surrounding area further suggests that they couldn't possibly have crashed. But if this wasn't the case, then what really did happen to Felix Moncla and Robert Wilson that night? One interesting detail in the case was the radar disturbance experienced by Robert Wilson while trying to follow the object. Mingenbach and his radar operator experienced no such disturbance even though they were flying in the same airspace, meaning it could not have been caused by an external factor such as weather. It also could not have been Wilson's onboard radar system, which malfunctioned, as it was thoroughly checked before takeoff. This all suggests that it was the unidentified object actively trying to jam their signal. This also suggests it must have been equipped with significantly advanced technology to be able to do so, meaning it could not have been a civilian plane or just a radar anomaly. Another interesting aspect of the case was the numerous contradictions in the reports of what happened that night. An official United States Air Force investigation concluded that Moncla's jet was sent to assist a Canadian C-47 Skytrain, which had apparently veered off course inadvertently. It was alleged that this aircraft was the unidentified blip which suddenly appeared on radar. In a later phone interview, however, USAF Public Information Officer Lieutenant Robert C. White would claim that it was in fact a Canadian DC-3, which was flying over Lake Superior that night. These two models are rather similar, so his statement was overlooked by many. The problem, however, is that the Air Force keeps meticulous records of every craft they have in the air and their route. Saying this, it's rather bizarre that White would change his story later on, especially considering he was involved in making the initial report where it was stated that the craft was a C-47. White would go on to state that this craft was piloted by Flight Officer Gerald Fosberg. He claimed Fosberg's DC-3 showed up as unknown on the radar because he was 30 miles off of his intended track and he was the one responsible for the mysterious blip. In a later interview for a documentary called Moncla's Memories, however, Fosberg would flatly deny this and state that he was nowhere near the location where Moncla and Wilson disappeared that night. He further claimed that he could never mistake being even a few miles off course, let alone 30. High-ranking Royal Canadian Air Force officials would also remain adamant that they had no aircrafts in that airspace at the time of the incident. Regardless, White's explanation doesn't answer why nothing of Moncla and Wilson or their jet was ever discovered. This unexplainable nature of the case, along with the numerous contradictions from the United States Air Force, led many to speculate that the official report was merely a cover-up. Felix Moncla's cousin, Buddy Moncla, also held this belief. Buddy heard rumors in town that the official story was fabricated, and he spoke to many of Moncla's associates who agreed with these rumors. When asked plainly if he believed his cousin encountered a UFO during an interview, he answered, quote, "There's no questions. What else? No one can prove otherwise." In a case as bizarre as this one, it does seem like this is the only logical conclusion, especially when you consider the seemingly impossible aspects of it. There was never a concrete explanation offered as to how Moncla's jet merged with the other object, where he and Wilson could be, or why their remains were never discovered, despite a huge search of over 10,000 square miles. On top of this, the U.S. Air Force was being extremely secretive and were very apprehensive regarding inquiries into the incident. To many, this alone was a telltale sign of something bigger going on underneath the surface. Moncla's older sister, Leonie Shannon, suspected a cover-up as well. She was adamant that the United States Air Force knew more than they were letting on. When interviewed by a reporter several years after the incident, she said, quote, "We still don't know anything. I don't think the government wants to let us know what really happened to him." Later, in the same interview, when Leonie was asked if she believes a UFO or an unknown force could have been behind her brother's disappearance, she answered, quote, "I think something like that could have happened." Although it's still unclear what happened to Felix Eugene Moncla and Robert L. Wilson that night, it seems that the general consensus among family and friends was that the official report was simply a cover-up of something truly anomalous. The story from the U.S. Air Force about a Canadian aircraft being 30 miles off track and somehow appearing suddenly on Kinross Air Force Base radars is simply too far-fetched to be believed. Instead, many, like Buddy and Leonie, speculate that Moncla was trailing a UFO, which was trying to evade him by jamming his jet's radar. When Moncla would continue his pursuit, the object captured his jet. This would explain why the two blips merged before Moncla's jet vanished. It could also explain how the unidentified blip was able to disappear from radar so quickly, and why the government didn't want to reveal too many details regarding the incident. Unfortunately, however, this case presents a unique situation in which there is enough evidence to conclude that something out of the ordinary happened that night, but not enough to say exactly what it may have been. This we may never know. In the majority of instances where an individual vanishes, there is often a linear progression of events which might explain what could have happened to them. There are those, however, who vanish in plain sight, under seemingly impossible circumstances, never to be seen again. Such was the case of a man named Owen Parfitt from England in the year 1768. Owen Parfitt was living with his sister, Mary, at the time, and he was staying at her cottage in Shepton Mallet, a small town located in the county of Somerset. He was not living with his sister by choice, however, but because he was virtually paralyzed and required assistance for day-to-day activities. Owen suffered from advanced rheumatism and was also a heavy drinker. By 1768, his old age, along with his deteriorating health, would catch up to him, resulting in his paralysis. On June 6th of that year, Owen wanted to soak up some summer sun on the front porch, which he greatly enjoyed doing in the warmer months. Due to his predicament, his sister would have to carry him outside, and she would do so with the help of a neighbor by the name of Susanna Snook. Mary and Susanna would place Owen outside in his greatcoat, wrapped up in a blanket as per the usual routine, and then go on about their business. Mary would go back inside to do chores, and Susanna would return to her home approximately 50 yards away. Across the road from Owen, several farmhands were working, as they had been the whole day. They were within easy earshot of Owen and in plain view of him. After a couple of hours, Mary could see that a storm was heading their way, so she decided it was time to bring Owen back inside. She went out to the front porch, expecting to see Owen relaxing on the chair, or perhaps sleeping, as he often did. To her utter shock, however, Owen wasn't there. The blanket which covered him was left on the chair, as well as the greatcoat he was wearing, but he was nowhere to be found. Mary first assumed that someone else may have helped him inside, as Owen would often ask a neighbor to do so if she could not hear him. but he was not in his room, nor was he anywhere on the premises. Mary then went house to house to see if anyone nearby may have seen him. However, nobody did. Perhaps most interesting of all was the fact that the workers out in front of the cottage had not seen or heard anything either. They could clearly see Owen from where they were working, and they were close enough to communicate with him. They surely would have noticed if somebody came to move him, but they never reported such a thing. At this point, Mary became worried, so she recruited some neighbors and other townsfolk to search for Owen. Unfortunately, it seemed absolutely no one in the whole area had seen him. This becomes all the more bizarre when you consider the placement of the Parfitt cottage. According to an article from 1877, it was on a turnpike road, surrounded by other cottages close at hand, and it was situated less than 100 yards away from the town center. So not only were there many people right in the vicinity of the cottage, but it was also located near the busiest part of town. This makes Owen's sudden vanishing even more perplexing, as there were simply too many witnesses in the area for absolutely no one to have seen him. Following Owen's disappearance, an extensive search for him was undertaken. Shepton Mallet was a small town where everybody knew one another, so everyone wanted to pitch in and do their part to find him. Unfortunately for them, however, they would never manage to do so. Police and neighbors scoured every single road which connected to the Parfitt cottage, walked through miles of fields, and even dragged several nearby rivers, all to no avail. An article in the Somerset County Herald would say of the case that, quote, "The helpless man had completely vanished, leaving the greatcoat hanging on the back of his chair. A most exhaustive search was made for him, living or dead. Every wood, ditch, pond, and well for miles around was searched, but in vain." By all accounts, it seemed as if Owen Parfitt, the man who couldn't walk, had simply vanished into thin air. But the question remains, what could have possibly happened to Owen? Due to the bizarre nature of the case, the general opinion at the time was that he had been spirited away by supernatural means. Modern analysis has come up with many theories as to what could have occurred that day, although none of them can completely explain the strange circumstances surrounding the incident. One idea is that Mary herself may have been implicated, as she had been the last person in contact with him, and she was the closest to where he disappeared from. Not only is there no evidence for this, however, but she was in her 80s at the time as well. It's very unlikely Mary could have mustered the strength to move Owen in such a short amount of time that nobody noticed her. Also, she would have had no reason to harm Owen, as they were known to have a good relationship. Another theory is that perhaps Owen had not been paralyzed all along, and he just walked off by himself. He was known to be a prankster in his younger years, and some people believe this may have been his final, ultimate prank. While in the realm of possibility, this theory too doesn't hold up under scrutiny. Why would Owen keep up this act for many years, only to suddenly vanish on a random afternoon? What could he possibly have benefited from this? Owen had not worked in years and had no money, so where could he have gone to anyway, if he did leave of his own accord? There is just no logical reason as to why Owen would just up and vanish, even if he could indeed walk. In any case, none of these theories can explain how nobody in the whole town saw Owen. The main point of contention in this case is how Owen Parfitt was somehow removed from a busy and populated area, all the while completely avoiding the detection of anyone nearby. Out of the many theories put forth over the years, none of them have ever been able to explain this fact. He would have had to have been carried out, and with the layout of the Parfitt cottage, it's simply not possible that this could have happened with absolutely no one noticing. This aspect of the case is really what drove the supernatural claims, as there is seemingly no other logical explanation as to how he was able to vanish from plain sight. Owen's greatcoat, which was left hanging off the chair, is another small detail in this case which adds to the mystery. We know that he was wearing it outside when he was first placed there by Mary and Susanna. If so, however, how did it end up so neatly placed on the chair? Had somebody wanted to take Owen, they would have had to have done so very quickly, as the area was heavily trafficked. Why then would they have taken the time to remove his coat and place it neatly on the chair? This doesn't seem like the actions of someone trying to be discreet. On the other hand, if Owen had walked away on his own accord, as some still believe, then why would he have done so? He was wearing his sleeping garments underneath his coat, so it would have made sense to keep wearing it, especially if he was trying to disappear without being seen. as he would have stood out far more roaming the streets in his pajamas. This is one detail that is often overlooked, although it is one of the more bizarre aspects of the case. A final alternate theory is that the story itself could have been skewed over the years. With the case being so fantastical, as well as hundreds of years old, many just assume the only possible explanation is that certain key elements were simply lost over time, which could connect the missing dots. The story, however, can be verified, and it is very well documented. There are numerous articles and publications on the case which date back to the 1700s. The earliest article written on it comes from the Bath Chronicle in October of 1789. They were able to confirm that he did in fact vanish on June 6th under extremely bizarre circumstances. Other than the articles, there are numerous records of Owen Parfitt himself having lived in Shepton Mallet during that time period. None of the records are able to provide a death date, however, which falls in line with the story. So, while the case may sound too astonishing to be true, we can confirm with historical records that it did indeed happen. Still unsolved after more than 200 years, the case of Owen Parfitt may go down in history as one of the most bizarre disappearances of all time. His paralysis added a degree of mystery to the story, which made it much more perplexing than other missing persons cases. When an individual vanishes, detectives will consider what actions they may have taken and where these actions could have led them. Since Owen was unable to walk, he could in no way have been responsible for what happened to him, which made it very difficult to investigate his disappearance. There was no logical starting point to the investigation. All police and neighbors were presented with was a seemingly impossible scene of a paralyzed man vanishing right from his porch in a busy area. It is almost no wonder that, at the time, people believed that Owen encountered a fate of supernatural origin. Whether you believe this, however, or simply that there is a logical explanation which somehow has not yet been considered, the only thing we can know for certain is that something truly anomalous did occur on June 6, 1768, in Shepton Mallet.